The Fall of Lucifer, a story of ambition, power, and consequences. In the grand tapestry of the Bible, there are few figures as compelling and enigmatic as Lucifer. His story is one that has captivated minds and sparked debates for centuries. With his rise and fall symbolizing the complexities of ambition, power, and the consequences of defying divine order. But who exactly is Lucifer? Was he merely a fallen angel? Or does his tale carry deeper lessons about the human experience? Lucifer was once one of the most beautiful and powerful angels in heaven. A being of immense grace and light. His name itself means light-bringer, a reflection of his position as a prominent figure in the celestial realm. He was favored by God and given a role of great responsibility. However, beneath his radiant exterior, there was a growing desire, a desire for more. The ambition to be greater, to rise above even the Creator, was a temptation Lucifer could not resist. In many ways, his story is not just about an angel's fall, but about the nature of power itself, the temptation of power, and how the pursuit of it, when unchecked, can corrupt even the purest of beings. This narrative resonates with us in ways we might not immediately realize. Just as Lucifer's downfall stemmed from a desire for ultimate control, so too do the struggles and moral dilemmas that we face in our own lives. Particularly in the realms of business and personal growth, the temptation to overreach, to act out of pride or ambition without regard for the greater consequences, is something we all grapple with at different points in our lives. As we explore the story of Lucifer in this biblical context, we will uncover more than just the tragedy of his fall. We will examine the deeper messages and warnings that his narrative offers, not just to religious followers, but to anyone seeking success, power, or influence in the world today. What does it mean to push too far? To chase power at all costs? And what are the lessons we can learn from Lucifer's tragic fate? The answers may surprise you. Lucifer's story begins in a place where few beings are ever able to reach: heaven. The very realm of perfection, where beauty, harmony, and power coexist in their purest forms. Lucifer, whose name means light-bringer, was one of the most extraordinary creations of God. He was not like the other angels, he was radiant, both in form and spirit, and his role was unlike any other. He was the highest of the archangels, the closest to the throne of God. His wisdom, his strength, his beauty, all were unmatched in the celestial realm. Lucifer was the epitome of divine creation, a being whose very existence reflected the glory of God. In the early days of creation, Lucifer's role was to serve and protect, to guide the other angels and oversee the heavenly realms. But as time passed, Lucifer began to grow more aware of his own magnificence. He realized that he was not like the others. He was more powerful, more beautiful, and more capable of greatness than any angel who had ever existed. His pride, which had been a subtle seed planted deep within him, began to sprout. This was not something that occurred overnight, but rather, over time. As Lucifer's influence grew, so too did his sense of superiority. He began to entertain a dangerous thought. Why should he serve at all when he was so clearly destined for greater things? Lucifer's internal conflict started with a simple question: why should I not be as great as God himself? This question began to plague his thoughts, clouding his mind with doubt and ambition. The very being who had been created to serve and lead others now began to see himself as equal to, or even greater than, the Creator. It was not enough for him to be a servant of God. He wanted to be a ruler. He wanted to have control. He wanted to be the one who dictated the terms of existence, not someone who had to follow them. This temptation grew within him, like a fire slowly consuming a once pure soul. The desire for power, control, and recognition became his obsession. Lucifer began to imagine a world in which he, and not God, was the ultimate authority. He began to challenge the natural order of heaven. He began to gather followers, those angels who, like him, were dissatisfied with their roles. They too were swept up in the promise of power. And together, they formed a rebellion against God. In the beginning, Lucifer's rebellion seemed justified to many. After all, he was the most magnificent of all the angels, and he questioned why the Creator, whom he had served faithfully, should be the sole ruler of the universe. His desire for autonomy was not inherently wrong. It was the manner in which he sought it that led him down a treacherous path. Lucifer believed that by taking control, he could create a new order, one that would be free from the constraints imposed by God. It was a vision of freedom, but a freedom that came at the cost of peace and harmony. He envisioned a world in which all beings could act according to their own will, free from divine authority. But as Lucifer's rebellion gathered strength, a crucial shift occurred. What had begun as a desire for equality and freedom transformed into a thirst for absolute power. It was no longer enough for Lucifer to be on the same level as God. He wanted to surpass him. He wanted to be the one who ruled over all creation. He wanted to be God. As his rebellion reached its peak, Lucifer and his followers began to challenge the very structure of heaven. The divine hierarchy was in jeopardy. The very essence of heaven's peace was threatened by Lucifer's desire for supremacy. His followers, once loyal servants, were now caught in the grip of a delusional vision of grandeur. Convinced that they were part of a greater cause, they believed they were destined for more, that they too could share in the power and authority Lucifer sought to claim. The conflict in heaven escalated as Lucifer's followers rallied around him. The war in heaven had begun. It was no longer a war of physical strength alone, but a war of wills, ideologies, and desires. Lucifer had convinced many that his vision of the universe, one where they could all be free from divine oppression, was the right path. The battle lines were drawn, with Lucifer leading the charge and God, unwavering in his justice, standing firm against the rebellion. But the war was not just one of external forces, it was a war that raged within Lucifer himself. As he led his followers into battle, he began to wrestle with the realization that his actions were not as pure as they had once seemed. He had started with a desire for freedom, but now he was consumed by the need to dominate. He had moved from wanting to be equal to God to desiring to be God himself. His rebellion was no longer about justice, it was about pride. This internal conflict was the tipping point. Lucifer had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In his pursuit of power, he had lost sight of the very qualities that had made him great in the first place: humility, wisdom, and reverence for the divine order. The ambition that had once been a spark of hope had turned into a destructive force that threatened not only his own existence but the entire harmony of creation. As the war in heaven raged on, God, in his infinite wisdom, saw that Lucifer could no longer be redeemed. The pride and ambition that had consumed him were irreparable. The battle between good and evil had reached its zenith. There was no turning back for Lucifer. He had chosen his path, and the consequences of his rebellion would be felt throughout the universe for eternity. And so, the great angel Lucifer, once the most beautiful and powerful of all beings, was cast out of heaven. His fall was not just a physical one, but a moral and spiritual one. He had chosen to defy the divine order, and in doing so had forfeited everything that made him the light-bringer. His fall from grace marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter in which Lucifer would no longer be the radiant angel, but the ruler of hell, a place of torment and suffering. His pride and ambition had brought about his destruction. The war in heaven had reached its peak. Lucifer, once the most glorious of all angels, now stood at the head of a rebellion that threatened to overthrow the divine order. He had gathered a large following, his charisma and power undeniable, convincing many of his fellow angels to join his cause. The rebellion, once driven by a desire for equality and freedom, had evolved into a full-scale war of supremacy. Lucifer's vision was no longer one of justice, it was one of domination. His heart, once filled with wisdom and light, had become clouded by pride and ambition. But despite the strength of Lucifer and his forces, heaven remained steadfast. God, in his infinite wisdom, did not engage in battle with Lucifer directly, but instead allowed the conflict to unfold in its own time. The battle was not just a physical one, but a battle of ideologies, wills, and divine purpose. Lucifer's rebellion was not merely an attempt to take power, it was an affront to the very fabric of existence. He sought to redefine the order of creation itself, to upend the natural balance that God had established. The war raged on, with Lucifer and his followers launching attack after attack, only to be met with the unwavering force of God's divine will. The angels loyal to God, those who had chosen to uphold the divine order, fought valiantly to protect heaven from the growing threat. The very foundations of heaven were shaking, and for the first time in the history of creation, it seemed as though the order of the universe itself was at risk. Lucifer, however, was determined. He believed that he had the right to rule, that his vision for the universe was more just and equitable than the order established by God. He saw God's will as oppressive, a force that limited the freedom of the angels and all creation. In his mind, he was the true liberator, the one who would bring about a new era of freedom. He believed that his rebellion was not a crime, but a necessary step for the evolution of creation. But in reality, Lucifer was blinded by his own pride, his desire to become the highest power, to surpass even God, was no longer about freedom or justice. It was about ego, about wanting to be the ruler of all. As the battle in heaven escalated, the angels who followed Lucifer began to realize the true nature of his rebellion. What had once seemed like a fight for freedom had morphed into a struggle for control. Lucifer's true intentions were becoming clearer with each passing moment. He wanted to be the one in charge, to become the highest being in all of existence. The power he sought was not the power of equality, but the power of domination. His vision for the universe was one in which he alone would reign supreme. A universe where all beings would be forced to bow before him. At this moment, Lucifer's true nature was revealed. He was no longer the shining, beautiful angel who had once served as God's closest confidant. He had become something else, something darker, more twisted. His pride had consumed him to the point where he could no longer see the consequences of his actions. His rebellion was not just an attack on God's authority, it was an attack on the very essence of creation itself. In the midst of the war, as the angels clashed and the heavens trembled, God finally made his decision. He could no longer allow Lucifer's rebellion to continue, for it threatened the stability of the entire universe. Lucifer's pride had reached its breaking point, and the only way to restore order was to cast him out. And so, with a single command, God cast Lucifer and his followers from heaven, sending them into the abyss. The fall of Lucifer was swift and devastating. In the blink of an eye, the most beautiful and powerful of all angels was cast out of heaven. Stripped of his grace and his power, the light that had once radiated from him was now extinguished, leaving behind only darkness. Lucifer, the once great light-bringer, was now a fallen being, condemned to live in the depths of hell. But the consequences of Lucifer's rebellion did not end with his fall. The impact of his actions was felt throughout the entire universe. The balance of creation had been disrupted, and the consequences of Lucifer's pride and ambition would resonate for eternity. As Lucifer and his followers descended into hell, they were confronted with the reality of their choices. They had fought for power, for control, but in the end, they had lost everything. Their rebellion had led to their ultimate destruction. They had sought to overthrow the divine order, and in doing so, they had brought about their own downfall. Hell, which had once been a place of darkness and punishment, was now the domain of Lucifer. It was a place where he would rule, not as a benevolent leader, but as a tyrant. His kingdom would be one of suffering, torment, and eternal pain. His once bright ambition had led him to a fate far worse than he could have ever imagined. And yet, even in hell, Lucifer's pride remained. He could not accept his fall. He could not accept that his rebellion had been for nothing. In his heart, he still believed that he had been right, that his vision for the universe was the correct one. But it was too late. Lucifer's fall had far-reaching consequences. The other angels who had followed him were now his companions in hell, and together, they would forever be trapped in a cycle of suffering and despair. The universe, once peaceful and harmonious, had been irrevocably altered by Lucifer's rebellion. The balance that had existed before his fall was gone, replaced by chaos and strife. And while Lucifer had hoped to bring about a new order, all he had achieved was the destruction of everything he had once held dear. The war in heaven, Lucifer's rebellion, and his subsequent fall were not just events in the celestial realm. They were lessons that would echo throughout eternity. Lucifer's story was a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of unchecked ambition, pride, and the desire for power. His fall from grace was not just a personal tragedy, it was a universal tragedy, one that affected all of creation. The fall of Lucifer was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new and tragic chapter in the universe's history. Cast out of heaven, Lucifer found himself in a place of darkness, far from the light he had once embodied. His once brilliant wings were now torn and shattered, his radiant form now obscured by the shadows of his own making. He had been stripped of his grace, his position, and his power. But even in the depths of hell, Lucifer's pride remained unyielding. He refused to accept his defeat. He refused to acknowledge the reality of his fall. In hell, Lucifer's rebellion continued in a different form. He now sought to corrupt and dominate those souls who found their way into his realm. Though he was no longer a being of light, he still retained his immense power and intelligence. He became the ruler of a realm that was as dark and twisted as his own heart. Hell was no longer just a place of punishment. It became a kingdom ruled by the fallen angel. A kingdom where the souls of the damned were subjected to endless torment, each one serving as a reminder of what Lucifer had lost and what his pride had cost him. But Lucifer's true torment was not in the suffering of others, it was in the realization that he had failed. Despite all his ambition, all his striving, he had lost everything. His desire to overthrow God had been futile. His quest for power had led to his own undoing. The very thing he had sought, ultimate control, ultimate freedom, ultimate supremacy, had eluded him. And in the silence of hell, in the eternal darkness, Lucifer was forced to confront his own pride, his own ego, and the consequences of his actions. The lessons of Lucifer's story are vast and profound. His tale is a warning to all who seek power, to all who chase after glory without considering the costs. Lucifer's fall is not just a tragedy of a single angel, it is a cautionary tale for all of us, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive nature of pride. The temptation of power and ambition. Lucifer's rise to power was built on a desire for recognition, for greatness, and for autonomy. His downfall, however, was not inevitable from the start. It began with a subtle shift, a shift from desiring equality and justice to desiring domination and control. His ambition, once noble, soon became a force that consumed him. The temptation of power can be seductive, promising freedom and fulfillment. But as Lucifer's story reveals, the pursuit of power without humility can ultimately lead to destruction. In many ways, Lucifer's rebellion can be seen as a reflection of the challenges that we, as individuals, face in our own lives. We too can be tempted by the allure of power, wealth, and success. We too can fall into the trap of believing that we are entitled to more, that we deserve to be on top, that we are meant to rule over others. But as Lucifer's fate shows us, unchecked ambition and a disregard for the greater good can lead to ruin. The perils of pride and the fall from grace. At the heart of Lucifer's rebellion was his pride, his belief that he deserved to be greater than God, that he should be the ruler of the universe, led him to make choices that ultimately destroyed him. Pride, when taken to its extreme, blinds us to the consequences of our actions and makes us deaf to the voices of reason and humility. Lucifer's pride led him to defy God, and in doing so, he lost everything that had made him great. Pride is a dangerous force. It can make us feel invincible, untouchable, and above reproach. It can lead us to make decisions that are not only harmful to others but also to ourselves. Lucifer's story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of allowing pride to take root in our hearts. It teaches us that true greatness is not found in seeking to dominate others or in striving for power at any cost. Rather, greatness lies in humility, in the recognition of our limitations, and in our willingness to serve others rather than seek to control them. The eternal struggle, Lucifer's legacy. Even in hell, Lucifer's struggle continues. He is not at peace, but remains trapped in an eternal conflict between his pride and the realization of his fall. He still believes that he is right, that his rebellion was justified, even though it has led him to a place of suffering and loss. This internal struggle is what makes Lucifer's torment so profound. It is not just the physical pain of hell that afflicts him, but the psychological and spiritual anguish of knowing that he is forever separated from the light and the Creator whom he once served. Lucifer's legacy is one of division, rebellion, and defiance. His name has become synonymous with the ultimate example of pride and ambition gone wrong. He is the embodiment of what happens when we place our desires above the greater good. When we let our ego drive our decisions without regard for the consequences. And yet, his story is not one of mere destruction. It is a lesson, a warning for us all. It is a reminder that the pursuit of power without wisdom, without humility, can lead to an irreversible fall. The final lesson, redemption and reflection. Lucifer's tale is a tragic one, but it is not without its lessons. His story teaches us about the dangers of pride, the allure of power, and the consequences of rebellion. It serves as a reminder that true greatness is not about dominating others or seeking control, but about humility, self-awareness, and serving the greater good. For those who seek to learn from Lucifer's fall, the most important lesson is one of reflection. It is not about demonizing Lucifer for his pride, but rather understanding the path he took and the choices he made. It is about recognizing that we, too, can fall into the same traps that led to his downfall if we are not careful. The story of Lucifer challenges us to look inward, to examine our own desires, our own motivations, and our own relationships with power and ambition. Ultimately, the fall of Lucifer is a story of loss, but also of eternal reflection. It is a story that asks us to consider what we value, what we seek, and what we are willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of our dreams. Lucifer's fall reminds us that no matter how high we rise, if we lose our sense of humility and our respect for the greater order of things, we, too, may one day find ourselves cast into darkness.